Alan Turing was a well-known mathematician, okay? A codebreaker during World War II, and many people, including myself, consider him to be one of the godfathers of the modern computer. Donald Rumsfeld was, amongst other things, Secretary of Defense under George W. Bush. Two very, very different people. Very different ideas, very different outlooks on life. But they had one thing in common. And that one commonality is that they understood the difference between complicated and complexity. And that's what I'd like to expand upon today, because it's something I'm very passionate about and something that I think that is very, very, very important. Most people think of complicated systems and complex systems as being the same thing. However, for those of us who are scientists, and in particular for those who are system theorists, they're very, very, very different. And I'd like to take an example from a fantastic book called Getting to Maybe, How the World Has Changed by Francis Wesley, Brenda Zimmerman, and Michael Patton. It's a fascinating book on social activism that outlines how complexity is different from complicated. And in this book, Getting to Maybe, they start off by describing a simple system. A simple system is baking a cake. You have a recipe, you have a set of directions, and if you follow the directions more or less, you get something that comes out to be more or less like a cake. Now, admittedly, my grandmother's going to bake a better cake than I am, but if you add a bit too much flour, no big deal. If you add a bit too much chocolate, wow, that's fantastic, this is good. And a little less water than's necessary, you still get something that's like a cake. Now we come to their analogy for a complicated system, which is getting an astronaut to the moon and back. To get an astronaut to the moon and back, there's 100,000 steps. And you have to get every one of those 100,000 steps down exactly. You have to be precise on your 100,000 steps. If you're off the least little bit, your astronaut's off on their way to Jupiter, and Major Tom becomes a major hit again. Then we come to a complex system. And this is something that's near and dear to my heart, raising teenagers. Now, I love my two teenage daughters desperately. They're absolutely fantastic. I'm a very, very, very proud father. But holy gosh, raising teenagers, that is complex. It's frustrating. It's exasperating. There is no rule book. There is no recipe. We might debate, whether Tiger Mom's strategy is going to win for raising teenager, but ultimately, nothing consistently works with teenagers. Teenagers are complex. What worked at 10 o'clock in the morning and made them happy no longer works at 10:15. Who was BFF yesterday is now banned from their Facebook page or whatever. Okay? It's incredibly exasperating. But it's also incredibly rewarding. And that's the key point. So let's get back to Alan Turing. Alan Turing came up with what's known as the Turing Test, which is basically a conceptual experiment. So you take a subject, let's say you, and you are going to carry on a conversation to two different curtains. Behind one curtain is a human being. Behind another curtain is a computer. And the Turing test is whether or not you, the subject, can determine behind which curtain is the computer and which curtain is the human being. Now, that might seem like a pretty easy task. In other words, I would like to think it's a pretty easy task for most of you here. But Turing was actually trying to illustrate 2 points. The first was a point about intelligence. A computer can store a virtually infinite amount of facts. But facts is not knowledge. Facts is not intelligence. Okay? The second point, and more germane to our theme here today, is you can't build a connection with a computer. Yes, I know the electrical engineers and computer engineers in the room are talking about one type of connection. I'm talking about a real thinking connection. You can build a connection with a human, You can't build a connection with a computer unless you've got some weird thing going on. And so ultimately, what we saw earlier, through Dr. Whitehead's talk, was whales have this connection. Okay? Computers don't. Now, I have a connection here with everyone in the room. I also have a connection with those watching on the web, and I have a connection with those who might deem to watch this video later. However, with each and every one of you, I have a different connection. My connection with you depends upon such subtle factors such as the ambient temperature in the room, who you're sitting next to, what happened to you on the way here. All of these things affect what you hear and what you see. Everyone's hearing and seeing the same me, fortunately or unfortunately for you. But what you're taking away and what you're going to act upon varies very, very much upon these subtle things. With these differences in connections, we get something called the butterfly effect. And technically, the butterfly effect is from chaos theory, so don't beat me up for those of you that are complexity experts in the room. But the butterfly effect, in essence, is that if a butterfly flaps its wings on the west coast, it can change the weather on the east coast. If you think about it, that's basically what the hit TV show Seinfeld was about. Generally up front, your complexity thinkers, George and or Kramer, would do something silly at the beginning of an episode, and then, 22 minutes later, it's mass hilarity as a range of totally unintended consequences come out. That's the butterfly effect. Now, how does Donald Rumsfeld fit into all this? Okay. Donald Rumsfeld is probably best known for his saying, which I'm going to paraphrase, that there's known knowns, there's known unknowns, and there's unknown unknowns. In other words, there are things that we know, there's things that we know that we don't know, and there's things that we don't know that we don't know. That's a wonderful description of the difference between a complicated system and a complex system. A complicated system is the known knowns. That's the physics that gets an astronaut to the moon and back. Complicated systems are systems that you can calculate. Complicated systems work by the laws of physics. They work by the laws of nature. However, the really interesting problems in business, in policy, and indeed in life are the complex problems. They come from the realm of the unknown unknowns. They're unpredictable. They're nonlinear. They come out of who knows what. They're based upon subtleties. They're based upon the butterfly effect. I want to describe to you a student of mine that I had in business school, who I will name Susan for the purpose of this discussion. Susan was an absolute dream as a student, and she's gone on to be a very successful financial engineer. Susan always came to class very well prepared. She was very conscientious in her studies, did very, very high quality work, and was very involved in classroom discussions. As I said, just a dream of a student. So one day we're doing a case analysis, and the class ends, and Susan comes up and says, Dr. Nason, what was the solution? And I said, well, I don't know. She goes, is this the solution? I said, maybe. She didn't like that as an answer, so she says, well, what about this? Is this a workable solution? I said, well, yeah, that probably could work too. And she thought I was toying with her, but I wasn't. Okay, and she got so upset. She says, well, this is the solution. And then she proceeded to faint. Well, you can just see your teaching ratings go right out the window when they faint in class. That's not recommended teaching strategy. But what had struck me is Susan is very, very typical of who we want as a business student. But Susan was stuck in a complicated thinking paradigm. Susan could not deal with complexity. And that's exactly how we're training our future business leaders and our policymakers. We're training them to calculate when, in a complex world, you cannot calculate. Business policy is not physics. It's not biology. It's not the natural sciences. Business and policy is based upon connections. It's based upon those subtleties that we get in a meeting like this. Complicated thinking gives you things like the economic crisis. Many people think that the economic crisis was caused by the greed of bankers. Personally, I don't think that bankers are any more greedy than you guys are. The point is, though, bankers have a tremendous amount of connections. And in the crisis, what we saw was the best minds in terms of banking, investing, in terms of policy, in terms of regulation, all of them ignored the power of connections and of emergence. And what we wound up with was a package of unintended consequences, namely the crisis. That's what complicated thinking gives you. What complexity thinking gives you is it gives you Facebook. It gives you Twitter. It gives you LinkedIn. It gives you TED conferences. Isn't that much cooler than an economic crisis? So what do we do about this? Well, Daniel Pink, in his book, A Whole New Mind, Why Right-Brainers Will Rule the Future, starts to give us some hints. There's many, many things that we can get from nature about dealing with complexity, but let's start with Daniel Pink's suggestion. And he suggests that business leaders think in terms of symphony, play, empathy, meaning. Now, for the creative people in here, those things are second nature. For policymakers and business leaders, those are fuzzy, vague ideas. But they're very much in line with complex thinking. They're very much in line with what we need. A few more suggestions is we've got to start to recognize when things are simple, complicated, or complex, and react appropriately. Okay? We can't assume automatically that things are complicated, even though we've spent all this time learning this theory. Okay? Secondly, we've got to learn to put up with getting to maybe. We've got to learn to accept that. Getting to maybe is acceptable. And guess what? The more you try to get to maybe, the more you get to success. The more you get to new ideas, the more you get to paradigm shifts. We need a new complexity prayer. Maybe you might be familiar with the serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. I want to change that to a complexity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot calculate, courage to calculate the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. Finally, we need to embrace complexity. Complexity is frustrating. Raising teenagers is frustrating, but raising teenagers is incredibly rewarding. Complexity opens up every new day with a whole bunch of unknown unknowns, a whole bunch of potentialities that range before us. I think that's cool. I think that's exciting. I think that that is what complexity is about. Ultimately, what we need to do is we need to remember it's not complicated. Thank you.